Dr. Fletcher, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk with me as we start a brand new school year. There's a lot of excitement as we look towards the days and weeks ahead. You're about a year into this role. Talk to me first to tell me a bit about what you've brought to this position and what you've learned doing this job so far.
I think the position has brought a lot more to me than I have to the position, to be honest. I've been able to see, you always hear about the great things that are going on in classrooms, but until you're actually boots on the ground and visiting those schools to see all the wonderful things that are going on, there's story after story of what we call vibrant learning that's going on in schools is learning that matters, that are relevant to students, that students are making an impact. So seeing that just really it rekindles that fire. You know, if you ever have any type of a day where you're struggling as commissioner or as an educator or as an administrator, just go into a classroom to see what our kids are doing. I do think that what I do bring to this is the fact that I've been in the classroom. I've been in Kentucky classrooms. I taught for years. I was an administrator in Kentucky school districts. I was a superintendent. So to be familiar with the processes, to be a part of the process, I think that's something that the people in Kentucky connect with. And I'm thankful for that because they've welcomed me from day one into every school district, into all areas I've been a part of. So the one thing I bring is that familiarity of being someone that has been in our classrooms, that's been in our buildings, that's been at our basketball games or academic matches, and also in those classrooms. And that connectivity, really, I think that relationship is easy to build upon.
One of the big goals you set whenever you first started this position was developing a new accountability system for Kentucky schools. Talk to me a bit about the progress that's been made on that, and perhaps more importantly, what would that necessarily mean for teachers and students on down the line whenever they have to sort of interact with that?
Over the past year, as a matter of fact, over the past 2 years, even prior to my becoming a commissioner, we set forth the moonshot. We wanted to put together, to launch, if you will, an accountability system that is both meaningful and useful to all Kentucky learners, students, teachers, and we'll say parents, people that are members of our communities. Over the past year, we've been a part of, I think, 9 different town halls that we've had over 600 people that have given us input. We've talked about the federal requirements in our new accountability proposal, if you will, but we've also talked about how can we also ask, what do our local communities expect of us? So if you graduate from, let's say, Cumberland County, and you get that diploma as a 18-year-old, as a high school student, and you get the diploma after you walk across the stage, what does that mean to your community? And I think our school systems are doing a great job of saying, you know, when you graduate, this is what it means to graduate from Shelby County or from Lawrence County or from other places that may be a little unique to what you're going to see at maybe in Jefferson County or Muhlenberg or something of that nature. So that local accountability piece has been huge. But as we've gone through 4 prototypes where we did surveys, we talked to people about what you expect in the next accountability model. What would you like to see? And after we took input, did surveys, we made changes. For example, early on, it was determined that from our surveys, we had about 92% of our respondents to say, we want to move from change to individual student growth. So currently, in our accountability model, you're looking at change being, how did this year's 3rd and 4th, 5th graders do versus last year's 3rd, 4th, 5th graders? So let's get away from that change model to where did you get this individual child and where did you take them? So early on, we heard from people, we took note of that and said, okay, our new accountability model will focus on student growth, not the change model. And that was early on in the prototype process. And then after we got through 4 prototypes, we got into what we would call a model framework. In other words, more specific with more details so that people could see what this would look like. And we actually went through 4 model frameworks to where we are now to say this is what I think a majority of our Kentucky folks would believe in as a part of how do we really determine growth in a student, not just academically, that's very important. We want to know where our students are in math, reading, and also in science. But we also want to say how have they grown as a collaborator? How's each student grown as a communicator? a global citizen, a problem solver, critical thinker. So those are the type of portrait of a learner work that you're seeing in so many of our districts. That how do you put that into a local accountability model? And that's what we've included into the new model as we've gone through. So the progress has been phenomenal. To be in those town halls, to listen to input, to listen to what districts are already doing has been a great process for us.
So I graduated from high school in 2015, and I went up to the Georgia public school system. So I'm not nearly as familiar with how it would have been if I grew up going to Kentucky schools. But essentially what you're talking about here, is it just a change in how state testing is performed, or is it something a little bit bigger than that?
It's bigger than that. If you look at, there's two parts to our accountability model. There's one that has the state accountability that meets federal requirements. We want to make sure we're doing summative assessments at the end of the year for both math and reading. The difference, there's a subtle difference there in that we want these to be adaptive model tests. In other words, if a student, if they answer a question correctly, then it'll give them a more difficult question, and then kind of pinpoint where they are as it relates to not only grade level content, but also to our state standards. So you're looking at state level content, but also add into that a grade level equivalency. While our parents are very familiar with and have heard the terminology of proficient, distinguished, apprentice, novice, but also too, I think it would mean a lot to our parents to say, my child's a third grader, but yet they're reading on the 5th grade level. So have that type of information in our state accountability model too. Of course, I mentioned growth, and that's a big part of our accountability model from what's required. Again, a change, but it fills one of the federal accountability buckets, one of the requirements, if you will, one of the buckets as we've called it sometimes. English language proficiency students, how they're progressing. And I think one of the biggest things over probably the past 15 years has been transition readiness. A lot of people may think of this as college and career readiness. What percentage of our students are getting dual credit? What percentage of our students are getting industry certifications? What percentage of our students are meeting the college benchmarks as we move forward? So we still have all of that in our accountability model, which is also used to help us identify those districts and schools that may need more help from KDE. So we can go in and say, okay, these are some processes you may need to implement. But also, too, there's a local accountability portion. And a part of that local accountability piece, it allows districts, actually it requires districts to meet with their local communities, to talk to their business leaders, to their religious leaders, to their parents, to their students, to say, what are our priorities? What are the things that we look forward to? And to give you a kind of an example of that, we have a couple of districts that look at students, how active are they outside the classroom? So their community looked at, one of the indicators we want is what percentage of our students are involved in activities outside of the school day. What percentage of our students are in JROTC? What percentage of our students are in band? What percentage of our students may be playing football or basketball? Because one of the best indicators of student success once they leave our buildings is how active are they outside the classroom activities. We have districts that have recognized that, and they actually have made growth plans to say, how do we improve? How do we make sure that every single student gets the opportunity to be involved, and how do we encourage them and make sure that they have that access to it?
As we look ahead to that new accountability model too, we're also looking ahead to 2026, and part of the work you do also kind of goes hand in hand with what has to be accomplished by our General Assembly. So is there any sort of budget priorities that you're really hoping to get accomplished as we move into next year, or any additional policy priorities you're going to be taking to them as well?
Well, we do have a published list of legislative priorities from our Kentucky Board of Education. And of course, one of the top priorities is the new accountability model. As we've talked a little bit about what that model looks like, that also requires funding. For this current year, we spend almost $14 million on state testing alone and having it scored and everything of that nature. So depending on all the parts that's included into the new accountability model, if we just did what's required, like I talked about earlier, the state accountability pieces that meet federal requirements, if we do that part alone, it'll be a little less. But then when you add in like supports for local accountability, opportunities for districts to do project-based learning, competency-based learning, so that they really feel like they have a better picture of what their students can do and what they're able to do. But we also have looking at opt-in parts for districts. For example, having interim assessments that districts could opt in that align with our summative assessments, so that you have one system that aligns with the state accountability so that teachers can get instructional information as soon as they administer that interim test. Now, for clarity, a lot of districts already have that process in place that they're already paying for. But what if we did this as a state and have one aligned assessment system so that districts will get that level of instructional information and they don't have to wait till the fall to get all the data that we provide for everyone. They have that instructional information throughout the year as opposed to waiting to the fall for that instructional data. Now, other things too is our legislature has made some huge investments in numeracy and literacy. We want to continue that. We've seen some local district data. If you look at our letters training, which is the science of reading, is what our push throughout Kentucky is to make sure that all of our students have the opportunity to go through that type of teaching method for reading. And then our teachers are trained in the science of reading so that we can see improvements. If you look at some of the data we're getting from our districts, if we have teachers that have been trained in letters and students that have had them for 2 years, we're seeing considerable gains in the level of proficiency for our students. So we want to continue that investment and expand that, but also do that with numeracy. So if we're seeing some positives from, if you will, return on investment already, imagine what return on investment we could get with more funding as it relates to numeracy and literacy. And again, our General Assembly has invested in those type of items already, and we want to make sure we continue those investments, but also increase those investments. Now, there are some other items too. Currently, kindergarten is fully funded through the budget process. Full day kindergarten is not codified. So each year, every 2 years, when we go through this budget process, it will determine whether or not kindergarten is fully funded. So what we would like to see is for that to be codified to say that full day kindergarten is funded throughout. So that it's not a question every budget cycle. Another priority of our state board deals with pre-K. We would like for all of our 4-year-olds to have the opportunity for pre-K. We see a tremendous increase in kindergarten readiness when students go through our pre-K programs, especially those in our public school systems. And so we're very excited about the possibility of that happening also. There's other funding. We'd like to see, again, I want to give the General Assembly some more credit. They have increased the amount of basic funding, but we'd like to see that increase. And one of the reasons that, for me personally, is teacher pay. If you look at some of our surrounding states, they've taken steps to make sure that there's a minimum salary for our teachers. And we don't want to lose our teachers to other states. We want to keep our people here so they can teach our students, because we think we have the best teachers. And we want to keep them here, and we want to make sure that it's funded in that manner. So we'll always advocate for a higher base level, not only for teacher pay, but also for other maybe gifted and talented programs or any additional supports that districts may need for math and reading. So funding will be a priority, but also through technology. We've asked for additional budget requests in our technology. We save districts, when I say we, the General Assembly through KDE, save districts a lot of funding from their general fund as it relates to how do we make sure that they get that technology funding that they need. The list goes on, but there's a great list you can have on our website of our priorities as we move forward.
Is there any concern that the recent audit of KDE will have any sort of influence among some lawmakers over their attitudes towards public education?
I've had a lot of one-on-one conversations with Auditor Ball, and we've had some good conversations about the audit itself, and there was a lot of positives in the audit. It may not be publicized as much, but there's a lot of noteworthy accomplishments by KDE. For example, our special education has met requirements for the past, I think, 16 or 17 years from the federal government. There's only 2 or 3 states that have done that. We have no audit findings when it comes to special education when it comes from the federal government. There's other things throughout that are noteworthy accomplishments, but there's also areas for growth. We'll be the first to admit there's things that we can do better. We've talked about, but we're going to need the help of the General Assembly on some of these. For example, the way school districts are funded for facilities. One of the things that's been asked for is how do we modernize that? And that's one of our priorities, but it's also one of the findings of the audit. So there are also some operational type things. For example, how can the commissioner do a better job of making sure that he communicates with all school districts? And so I've already implemented a recommendation by expanding some special assistants that work part-time to work with different regions of the state to say, okay, what are some communication or maybe some recommendations that you have for the commissioner coming directly from superintendent. So there's a lot of recommendations there that we value, that we think that are very important, that will help us to grow. Of course, there's some things we disagree with, and we're talking to the auditor about that. But still yet, there's an area there where we can maybe clear up some misconceptions. So overall, there's some items there that would require help from the General Assembly, maybe even some help from the governor. For example, how people are appointed to our Kentucky Board of Education to make sure that we have more business leaders. We have some already, but have more business leaders on our Kentucky Board of Education. So there's room for growth. And if there's anything that, as far as what we've disagreed with, we've included that in the audit, and we had that opportunity, and we're thankful for that. But again, I think if you read through the entire audit, all 400, our rebuttal starts on page 466. I think it goes all the way maybe to 556. There's a lot of areas for growth, and I think overall there's some good opportunities for us. Again, we're not going to agree with everything, and honestly, sometimes things hurt, but that's how you grow. How do we make sure that we make some changes? So if there's any questions about the audit, if people would have, I highly recommend that you go through the audit. I think you'll see some great things in it, but you also see, starting on page 466, some of the things we disagree with, and that's okay to disagree.
Since you mentioned pre-K, that's been an issue where we've heard a lot of different takes from the General Assembly, and in the broader sense, there doesn't really seem to be much appetite for it, especially in the past few sessions. How does KDE plan to sort of navigate the politics around that particular issue as you all push for that to be a thing?
I think for us, it's about making sure that we give the General Assembly the correct data. For example, we're releasing today the ratings for our preschools, our public preschools, and those are all very favorable. I do not believe that we had a single, on a 5-star scale, I don't think we had a single preschool that rated below a 3. Well, that's very important for our General Assembly to see that, to see the quality of what you see in public education. And again, there's public and there's private, and there's some great private preschool options too. I just happen to think public education is the best route. But with that being said, I think it's up to us, no matter what the decision, is to make sure that we keep the General Assembly informed so they know what the data shows and what improvements there can be. For example, look at some of the research that I've seen, and it varies, but for every dollar invested in preschool, it has a return on investment of 7 to 10 times. And they have different measures for that. So for me, again, it's about KDE providing that type of data to the General Assembly. Now, some of the issues you're going to find in schools is maybe some districts don't have the facilities, the space. So how do we partner maybe with private institutions or maybe churches or others to make sure that we have that type of space? Also certifications, making sure that you have certified teachers in those preschools. For me, preschool is so much more than just daycare. It's about making sure students are ready for kindergarten. So I think our process that we use in preschool is very good, and I think there's a lot of data to support that. So in short, I think that with our conversations with the General Assembly, once they see that, they fully understand that you just can't flip a switch in preschool for everyone starts next year. It would take a long process of maybe 2 to 3, maybe even 4 years to make sure that you have enough qualified teachers, to make sure you have the facilities. So it is a large investment to make sure as you move forward, but I think it's an investment that's worthwhile.
One more question on money before moving on here. And this is kind of dealing more with some local issues, but I want to at least get your take on it. So recently in Fayette County, there was an attempt at increasing the property tax there to make up for, I think, a shortfall there for FCPS. In Bath County, there was a proposed nickel tax that was voted down. We saw with the Amendment 2 vote that there is very robust support for public education within the state, but whenever you're asking a bit more from folks, there seems to be a very negative response. What do you take away from some of these particular situations, and does it have any sort of effect on up the chain on KDE?
Well, you've quoted some areas where maybe communities have pushed back. And as well, you should welcome that as a leader. You need to justify. If we're going to raise taxes, we need to justify to our local communities. But there are numerous communities that were very successful in passing like the nickel tax, or maybe increasing taxes to make sure students are getting proper facilities, buses, technology, things of that nature. So, you know, the challenge for each leader is to say, okay, this is the reason why we're increasing taxes, or this is the reason why. Do you have buy-in to that? You know, as a former superintendent in Lawrence County, we were unsuccessful in getting the nickel tax, which really set Lawrence County behind when it comes to how do we update our facilities. You know, we tried to inform our district, but on the other hand, when a community tells you no, then you got to find other areas. You got to find other methods. You're still not going to be able to afford facilities like they are now. I think a great example of the change in the cost of facilities would be Scott County. And I'm going to quote a couple numbers, and I'm not sure they're exactly exact on, but I want to say that when Great Crossing was completed, right around COVID, right a little bit prior to COVID, I want to say that was about a $60-some million project for a new school. And if you've been there, it's worth every dime. Well, they tried to build a Scott County High School that was the mirror image of Great Crossing. And I want to say that the cost of that building after COVID was over $100 million. So they had to change their plan because that was well without their budget, outside of their budget. So they had to change their plans. Now again, the new Scott County High School, beautiful. I've been through that building. You know, as a matter of fact, my son was there for a few days before he decided he wanted to go back home. But it is a facility that I'd be thrilled for any student to be a part of. But they still had to make some changes, maybe and make it a little bit smaller because they really couldn't afford that. So I say that is because that impacts bonding potential. If you look at, take Lawrence County for example, if they were to pass a nickel tax, I believe that their bonding potential would go up to maybe $40 million. That's probably the low end of building a brand new elementary school. After you do site prep, after you do other things that have to go along with that, in this day and time. Whereas in years past, you probably could have built the same elementary school with $17 to $20 million. So with that being said, I think that when you raise taxes, you have to inform your people to say, these are the reasons why. And expect pushback, as you should, as you go through. But there are numerous counties that have said, you know what, we're going to take that investment in our kids. We're going to make sure that our students have the best facilities, that they have the best opportunities, and then we will go in and make sure that they get that nickel tax, if you will, or maybe they'll get that 4% increase that districts can do without having a recallable process. So at the end of the day, I respect our superintendents. I think they're trying to make the best decision for students, but sometimes we have to analyze our budgets to say, what are we going to pull back? What are some things that we need to cut to make sure these things are happening? And I think that's what you're going to see across our state as we move forward, especially since our COVID dollars, ESSER monies, are now gone away.
So there's some new legislation that's going to be impacting the classroom this year. A lot of it seems to be dealing with technology in schools. There's been a big reaction to Senate Bill 181. That's been the big school communications bill determining, you know, how teachers can connect with students. And then there's also House Bill 208. That's been a basically broad enough cell phone ban within the classroom. You know, I can think back to whenever I was in school. I'm pretty sure I got a smartphone my sophomore, junior year of high school. It was almost second nature to text an advisor with FFA or you know, some other club or organization I was with that maybe I had some sort of after-school activity. Why do you think, you know, now in 2025 is when there's been such a big reaction to trying to get technology out of the school and more, you know, focused on this more old-fashioned way of teaching?
I think when you look, let's go with Senate Bill 181 first. A lot of people call that the traceable communication bill. And you can still have your basketball coach, your FFA sponsor, can still communicate with students, but it just needs to be through a traceable communication system. That's where that parents can view that. So at its heart, the Senate Bill 181, in my opinion, was to be more about student protection, student safety. Unfortunately, the 0.0005% of bad players, if you will, from time to time, and unfortunately we have that in education, in other fields too, we want to make sure that our students are protected. So at the heart of Senate Bill 181, I think that it was a very positive thing to say, we want to make sure our students are safe. Now, on the other hand, there are some things that need to be changed. You know, once you implement a bill, you really don't see its impact until districts start implementing it. For example, definitions of relatives. There needs to be a broader part of how that looks like for what exactly is a relative, and that needs to be expanded maybe into the in-laws, your mother-in-law, father-in-law. That's not part of the original bill. I will give Senator Titchener a lot of credit. She actually called in a lot of K groups, including KDE. She had, there were CAPE, CASA, KEA, KASS, the superintendents, the teacher organizations, the administrative organizations, and other people throughout the state to say, what changes do we need to make? And so I'll look forward to the amendment to Senate Bill 181 to see what changes can be made to make this something that is very beneficial to our students, but also protects our students. Now, as far as removing cell phones out of the classroom, one of the things that, in talking with other state chiefs, I've talked to a couple others that have implemented just a strict, from bell to bell, no cell phones. There was a lot of pushback from families because families are now used to, if I want to text my child, I can do it. I have immediate access. And they forget when they were raised, you had to call the front office. But with that being said, we're hearing from other states that when they've implemented this, that students, when they went home, became more interactive. You know, instead of having a conversation at the dinner table with somebody with the phone in their hand looking at that while they're eating, now the phone's being put down. And there's a lot more interaction, communication, and more social skills. So we want students to be able to interact face-to-face. But also, too, that is a tool. So districts do have the leeway of what does the policy look like in your district. For example, do you want to use it during maybe in the cafeteria, during lunchtime? Maybe a teacher can say, you know what, we need this for an instructional purpose. You have to have specific permission from your teacher to open it and how you're going to use it. But the districts do have some flexibility on how to implement that from district to district. Overall, I think that's always a great idea to sit down the electronic device and just get to know the person across the table.
I think a lot of folks watching would probably agree with that.
Yeah.
There's some other legislation that's impacting things a bit more behind the scenes. You mentioned the Read to Succeed Act and the numeracy counts bill, those dealing more with math and literacy. How can we continue to build on those and improve the rate of success for students in these particular subject areas, or even expanding it to additional subject areas? For example, I know that science scores, at least going off the most recent KSA release that I looked at, could be an area that could use attention. Is that type of legislation something y'all are going to be pushing for?
Absolutely, and I think one of the key parts to make sure that this continues to have success and it expands is making sure that we have coaches. Because let's face it, our teachers are in the classroom now may not have received training on the science of reading, or at least it may have been a few years since they've had that type of training. So it's up to us as a department to work with our co-ops, our education co-ops, and we have 8 of those across the state, and also to work with our local districts to make sure that we're providing the type of training so that teachers get the training now and they can implement it tomorrow. But that is a process that takes a lot of time. So we need more funding for those type of coaches. And as far as literacy, we've received a lot of funding, but we want to see that same level of funding in numeracy and even expand that. If you look at some states that have tremendous success with that model, they've implemented a lot of money not only with coaches, but also with high quality instructional resources to make sure that beyond textbooks, not just textbooks, but the resources that align with the science of reading, the numeracy initiatives, and the standards that we have to make sure our students are getting that implementation. So as we move forward, we have a great foundation, a great baseline, and we have thousands of teachers that have been trained in the science of reading, but we want to expand that to make sure we have an opportunity for all teachers to be trained, not only in the science of reading, but also in our numeracy work too. So I think the big push there for us will be how can we have more funding as it relates to increasing the number of coaches, but also the implementation of high-quality instructional resources.
Now, from my understanding, the state test scores, they will be released a little bit differently this year. Since they're not public yet, is there anything you can at least share to give us an idea of what we may see?
Well, you know, we always, for several years now, KDE has released individual student scores to districts typically in that first week of August. Our release this year was August 6th, but you're not going to see the overall data, you know, what percentage were proficient, what percentage were distinguished, things of that nature, until later on. We took a little bit of a change in our science assessment. You know, our science assessment before was very long passages that had questions related back to the passages that was almost like an endurance reading test, if you will. So we wanted to include those type of questions because we want to see how the cross-cutting type of standards and competencies that go across physics, biology, chemistry, and it's hard to analyze that without those longer passages. So we made some shorter passages with our testing group to make sure there's more maybe specific content that's assessed and also some standalone questions too. But whenever you do a change in an assessment, you have to go through a standard setting process. We want to make sure that those results also align with NAEP, also with our ACT scores, also with our AP scores to say, okay, this is the type of data that we're getting on our state assessment, and these are the students that are scoring 31, 32, 33 on the ACT. Is that data aligning? So it takes time for that process. So the overall release for data is going to be delayed this year to November because we have to go through that standard setting process where we pull in teachers across the state to make sure that we do that properly. So districts get individual scores, but the overall scores won't be released probably till November. I'll have to go back and look at the timeline for that, but I think it's November when those are to be released. In order to get the overall scores, we have to have the science scores to be a part of that. So again, districts have gotten the individual student scores. They can see those. They can also make predictions on their proficiency, things of that nature based on that information we've given them. One other thing too that Kentucky is a little bit different is we also do a quality control period, whereas we will release that type of data, the overall data, to districts to give them an opportunity to review it. We want to make sure they have the opportunity to say, okay, we agree or disagree with this. Maybe this percentage of our students were in our district within 100 days, whereas these were not. So there's some opportunities for cleanup, if you will, before we give the final release to the public in general. So again, we want to make sure our districts have the opportunity to review that also.
Teacher shortage is a term I've not heard pretty recently. I'm curious how we are doing in terms of our employment of teachers, the rate of vacancies, and also when it comes to dealing with that particular issue, how much have e-certifications, emergency certifications sort of played into that?
Well, a lot of times, well, let me rewind for a second. Last year, we realized that it was hard to give clean data to our legislators about how many vacancies that we have. If you look at the current system that we have for vacancies, basically a district will post an opening, maybe in elementary reading, to this particular website, and then that's part of it. They have to post that to our KEP system, and then people will apply, things of that nature. But sometimes districts don't take that posting off that registry, and the reason for that is they feel like they may need a reading teacher again in the very near future, so they keep those postings up there. So what we did last year is we actually did a survey, and we waited till September to say, how many openings do you have now that are not filled? And I was able to give a report to our Interim Joint Committee on Education so they could see what openings we have. And we do have a copy of that report we could give for you. Well, we're doing the same process this year. We'll wait till September, because if it's September 1st or September, in that first 2 weeks of September, if you haven't filled positions at that point, you're in a critical area because you've already been in school for a month, and if you've had every effort to fill that high school math teacher, or maybe the special needs teacher, or your ESL teacher, things of that nature, if you haven't filled it by September, you're probably going to have to look at some type of emergency certification, or you're going to have to look at some other method to make sure that happens. On the bright spot, I know that last year that our emergency certifications were down compared to the previous 2 years. We had a huge increase right after COVID of how many emergency certifications we were doing to fill those spots where maybe we had a teacher that had some background in music and had some other areas where they've done some maybe some classes in music, and then they could get emergency certified for a year so they can continue to work on their certifications, but go ahead and teach in the classroom. Those emergency certification situations have decreased when we compare 24-25 data versus data from previous years. So we're very pleased with that. Had a huge increase, I think it was 2021 of, I want to say probably at least 2/3. Well, let me stop back there. We had a huge increase in 2021 in our number of emergency certifications. So since then, it had been increasing until 24-25, and we've seen a decrease in that. We see that as great data to say we're making sure that we're keeping our teachers in the classroom, but still yet we have a shortage, particularly when you get into science at the secondary level, or maybe even special education teachers or ESL teachers, things of that nature. We have shortages in a lot of areas and in different regions of the state. It may be easier to get a elementary teacher in Fayette or Jefferson, but maybe in our areas like Fulton County, it may be more difficult to find an elementary teacher. I will say some anecdotal data that I'm hearing from personnel directors is they're having more applicants this year than they have in the years in the past. So we're seeing some positive trends, but we still need to make sure we push forward with our recruitment efforts, anything that we can do to say, hey, this is the job that you want. This is the career because you can make the most difference in a student's life. So we were looking forward to that data as we move forward.
The importance around school security is one area where there's been a lot more attention that's grown over the years. Can you talk to me a bit about how we're doing in terms of just the total number of SROs we have employed across the state, and if there's any areas where we need to maybe look at some improvements? I know we've not had an incident since 2018 in Marshall County. We've had the School Safety and Resiliency Act in effect for some time now, but is there more work to do there?
I don't think you can stop at any point when we talk about the safety of our students. As a former superintendent, as a former administrator, I would ask students a lot in group settings, what do your parents expect most of all? When you come to school, what do they expect? What's the number one priority for your parents? And no matter what the group, they would say, well, they expect us to learn. They expect us to get an education. They expect us to make sure that we behave, or depending on the age group, you get those type of questions. And out of all the years, only one time did I have a student get the question correct. And they said they expect us to come home safely, first and foremost. So anytime that you invest money in school safety, it's huge. It's something that's very important as we move forward. So that being said, we're seeing more and more districts to do things like safety vestibules, where you can check into an area and say, okay, you're in a holding area to be checked into the principal's office before you go into a building. We're seeing more and more districts invest in SROs. But, and again, our state legislature invested some money into SROs, but we need more funding like that to make sure that every single school, not every single campus, but every single school has an SRO for that safety, because I think that's an important piece. Again, there has been huge investments, just like you talked about with bills in the past where there's been investments with school safety. We want to continue that, but to add into that. So any funding that our General Assembly wants to put towards whether it be SROs, safety vestibules, safety measures for buses, things of that nature, we're in full support and advocate for that.
So I always like to wrap these up with something a little bit, fun and light to sort of put a bow on things. So as we start a new school year, we're talking education here. Is there a particular book you may want to recommend for either teachers or students in the days and weeks ahead that may be helpful for them? Or is there maybe a quote you'd want to share that may be something to take with people as they go into the new school year?
I think that I'll end with this. I think that what we need to realize that we have a huge responsibility as educators. And we have the responsibility to make sure that students have opportunity. And I classified in that in 3 areas. The very first one is the opportunity to dream. So many of our students come into our classrooms and their normal is very different to what our normal would be. So there's many times we'll have to say, this is your potential. And it's so much more than what you're seeing in front of you. So we want to make sure that students have that opportunity to dream, and we give them those, you can see what the world has for you. Not only the world, but also our local communities. There's so many opportunities within our local communities that you can come back home and serve in this capacity. But we want that to be a part of your dream, and we want to help mold those dreams. But also, too, I think we have to give students an opportunity to persist, to struggle. Life's not easy. We want students, when they go off to college or they go to a career technical school or they go into the workforce or into the military, that they've had some struggles with us, that they've been pushed to a point of like, you know what, I've faced something like this before and I succeeded with the help of the people around me. So I think we have that opportunity to make sure that students have the opportunity to struggle, to persist, if you will, but we're there for supports. And at the end, every single student needs the opportunity to succeed. Can we identify goals for you? Maybe small goals so you have those quick success, those quick wins, if you will, to say, you know, this is a goal that's set in front of you maybe in 2 weeks, and you can hit that goal. Then all of a sudden, that dreams start growing. That grit grows. Then all of a sudden they feel like, you know, we can do this because we went to a Kentucky school. We can do this because we had the success in our classroom, outside our classrooms. So I think for us, there's a huge responsibility. So if you want to quote, my quote would be, we have a huge responsibility to make sure that our students have the opportunity to dream, the opportunity to persist, and the opportunity to succeed.
Got to be all in, right?
Got to be all in. And that's the other thing too, is that I tell people all the time that we have to be all in for those type of relationships. You have to make sure that you have those type of relationships so that you know those dreams, that you know those how a child defines success and how you can help to shape that and push that and make that grow. So at the end of the day, we want everyone to be all in, and we have a staff throughout our Commonwealth. We have people throughout our Commonwealth that invest daily into our kids, and we're seeing that return on investment because all of our people are all in.